Well, good morning, folks. Welcome back to 3 Zen. This morning I have a couple stories to share with you. The first about my PAS, my Professor of Aerospace Studies in Bowling Green, Ohio, from 1965 through 1968. Lieutenant Colonel Wes Hoffman. He came in, like I said, in my sophomore year, 1965. And I immediately liked the guy. I don't know what it was about him. He was a straight shooter. He was straightforward. He was fair. And I did like him a lot. I liked listening to his lectures. And I just liked listening to him talk. At any rate, in 1967, I received a letter at my house in White House, Ohio, addressed to Lieutenant Colonel R.F. Holliker. Well, I knew who the letter was going to. It was going to my dad. And I knew kind of what it was for. But since I was almost a lieutenant colonel in ROTC, I figured it must have been me. Well, I opened it up and sat down and read it, and it got my attention. What Colonel Hoffman said was, "Dear Colonel Holliker," he said, "in recognition and honor of your service," he said, "I'm writing to you out of my concern for your son, Bob." He said, "Well, Bob's doing fairly well in ROTC. His work overall sucks canal water." I was carrying a 2.03 acume at that time in college. And he said, "One of the problems we have is he has a designated slot to become an officer, and if he cannot graduate at the time designated, he'll lose that slot." Well, I sat down and read that letter and went, "Oh, crap." And I knew he was right. There's just no getting around it. So I didn't forward it to my dad because I'd had enough thrashings by that time. I didn't need another one, either physical or verbal. So I just kind of filed it away and knuckled down. And as it turned out, I knuckled down to the degree I raised my acume from 2.03, graduating with a 2.05. Pretty proud of myself. At any rate, I saved that letter for the better part of 20 years. And would occasionally come across it and read it, and it kind of served as inspiration about, "Bob, you need to get your ass in gear here." But anyway, when I retired from the Air Force, I moved back to White House, Ohio, and Colonel Hoffman, as it turned out, had gone on from his career in the Air Force to become the mayor of Bowling Green. And then he subsequently retired and lived in BG. So I kind of knew that. And one day I called him up and I said, "Colonel Hoffman," I said, "this is Bob Holliker. I don't know if you remember me or not." He said, "Oh, yeah." He says, "I remember you." And oh, crap. Okay. I said, "I just moved back to the area, and I'm wondering if you would be available to meet for coffee sometime or another." He said, "Well, sure." So we set up a date and a time and a place. We met at Kermit's, which is a local diner there in BG. Went in and met him, and oh my gosh, that was so cool to meet him. And we had a great conversation talking about different personalities that was in the unit when we were there and where they went and so forth. At one point during the breakfast, I pulled out one of these little blue folders they used to give us our awards in. And I had taken a copy of that letter, and I put it on the left side of the award folder. And then I made a copy of my Air Force retirement and put it on the right side of that folder. And I presented it to him. Nothing fancy, just him and I sitting there over a nice cup of coffee, if you will. And I said, "Colonel Hoffman," I said, "I wasn't ever one of your politically correct pretty kids. But," I said, "damn it, sir, I made it. And I made it in no small part because of the interest that you took in me in 1967 with writing this letter to my folks." I said, "Now, they never got it, but I got it. I read it, and it resonated deep within me. And I really have appreciated that. He looked at that letter and you could have blown him over with a breeze. Anyway, he looked up at me and smiled and he said, Bob, he says, we obviously saw something in you. And he said, we didn't want to take a chance on losing you. And I said, well, sir, I said, you got my attention. So he took that letter then. This was about 1991. Both my folks were still alive. And a couple weeks later, I get a call from Mom. She says, hey, she says, we just got 2 letters that were really interesting. And she and my dad told me about Colonel Hoffman had taken a copy of that letter, made a copy, and then wrote another letter on top of that explaining what the whole drill was. And, well, as you might suspect, I have both copies in a file today. At any rate, we began a friendship in those days in 1991 or so that lasted until he passed away, I think in 2000, close to that, maybe even 2010. At any rate, we would meet once every 3, 4, 5 weeks for coffee and just chat about things. And it was just so mesmerizing to listen to him. He had been born in 1921 and in 1940s, in the mid 40s, went into the Air Force through the Aviation Cadet Program and came out as a navigator. And in 1944, he was flying as a navigator on B-24s at night, bombing Japanese shipping on Chinese rivers, on rivers in China, in rainstorms and so forth. They had a rudimentary radar in those days, and he would find targets floating up the river. Well, they had to be Japanese. Who else would be silly enough to go out in conditions like that? And they would bomb them. 23 years old, can you imagine? And then after the war, he went on to pilot training and received his wings and flew the B-29 and the B-47. But I came to know and love him as our PAS. One other little side note. The picture you see on this video clip is of him and Richard Nixon. Early on in the 60s, well, it had to have been after 65, but certainly before his presidency, Nixon came to Bowling Green to talk to the Young Republicans or some group, and they wanted somebody to stand in the receiving line and introduce Mr. Nixon to the dignitaries coming through. And they wanted somebody wearing a uniform, so they called up the ROTC detachment and asked Colonel Hoffman if he would do the honors, and he said, certainly. Well, during the receiving line, or during the reception, there were a couple guys that kept Nixon and Hoffman plied with drinks. So they were standing there drinking their drinks and shaking hands and so forth. And toward the end of the presentation or the event, Colonel Hoffman says, Mr. Nixon, he says, could I have a picture with you? He says, I think one of these days you're going to be going somewhere. He says, I think you're going on to bigger and better things, if you will. So that's the story behind that picture. So all I can tell you is I am so grateful for having known Colonel Hoffman, for having him as my professor of aerospace studies, a mentor, and a good friend. Colonel Hoffman, you always have a very special place in my heart, sir. Thank you.